Welcome. My name is Ryan Droletti. I'm a farm and agribusiness management specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. Today, we're going to talk about the trends of Iowa farmland ownership and the conservation conversation. Today, as we start thinking about farmland, going to give you the global view, that 10,000 view foot level. As we think about arable farmland in the world, the greener areas, as I show this first map here, the nice bright green areas are the areas of the highest quality soil resilience. And as you look across the map, there are just a few areas in the world that have that type of soil. One of those areas in the world is right here where we're sitting in the central part of the United States. To drill down maybe a little bit farther, and you hear individuals talk about the Corn Belt of the U.S., right? Well, where is that green arable land in the United States? And here it is. This is a cropscape map, originally a USDA map. I think it's now housed at the University of Birmingham, Alabama. This map, as you can see, I've grayed out the areas that don't have cropland. The areas that are in color, each color represents a different crop that is a cultivated crop in the United States. And as you look from North Dakota down through South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, there's your Corn Belt. For that visual graphic for individuals, and we talk about where's the Corn Belt, there it is. The Corn Belt, for the colors in this map, I've got yellow is corn, green is soybeans. You can look down through Kansas, Texas. I've got wheat, I've got cotton, I've got different colors for every different commodity that is grown, cultivated commodity. You've got that strip from Georgia up through South Carolina, North Carolina, through Virginia and Pennsylvania to New York. You've got the upper plains of Montana, the alfalfa grown in Idaho. You've got also the nice area around the Mississippi River Delta. And you've got the area through California, the central area of California, where there are a lot of different cultivated commodities and food crops grown in the state of California. Today, though, we're going to talk about Iowa. But this just kind of gives you that global perspective down to the national perspective, where crops are grown, what crops are grown where. And as we look again at that Corn Belt, what do we grow in Iowa and through the Corn Belt? Corn and soybeans. Yellow again, corn, that green being soybeans, and you can see the different cultivated acres across the state and where that concentration of corn and soybeans are in the state of Iowa. So as we think about farmland, now we're going to go into, here's their farmland, here's the Corn Belt. Well, now, what are some of the trends that we're seeing in farmland, right? And our ownership. This is the current data. New data will actually be coming out here shortly on farmland value in the state of Iowa. This is our graph from the Iowa State Survey on farmland value for the nominal, and we also adjust it for inflation from 1970 up to the 2022 survey. 2023 survey is coming out shortly. But as you look at the different points, you can see this trend in farmland value. You see the nominal value in the late 70s, early 80s, the value getting up to $2,147 an acre on average in the state of Iowa. Peaking again early 2010, 11, 12 at $8,854, coming back down to $7,264. Last year, the survey came in at $11,411, and that's the solid line, that nominal value. If we adjust for inflation based on 2015, that is the dotted line that goes up a little bit higher. You can see that inflation adjusted value in the late 70s, early 80s, just slightly breaking over that $6,000 mark. Currently with inflation where it was in 2022, being lower than the nominal value. With inflation adjusted for 2023, we'll see where that one comes in on the survey. So that's how the farmland value in Iowa has changed over time. And if you compare, we'll step back just a second and go back to the U.S. and looking at farmland value across the U.S. Iowa, this is a USDA survey that comes out every year in August. This one was released August 4th of 2023. We'll look forward to another one in this next coming August. You can see that the USDA came out with their cropland value survey by state. Iowa came in at $10,100, which was an 8% increase from the prior year. And you can kind of look as well at some of those other Corn Belt states of 9,000, 8,000, down to 6,000 as well in different states, even up to North Dakota of $2,600 an acre for nominal value for cropland value. Now, Iowa, if anyone ever tells you that Iowa has the highest farmland values, that is not quite correct. There are a few states that are a little bit higher than us. We look over to the West Coast to California at over $15,000 an acre for farmland. And then you look over to the East Coast when you look at New Jersey with $18,000 per acre, which was a 13% increase from the prior year. California had a 3% increase, but that hopefully gives you a more of a local, not just the local view of what you're thinking of the land values doing in the state of Iowa, but throughout the Midwest and the Corn Belt, and as we get to the East Coast versus the West Coast of the state of the United States. So then as we take a step back into Iowa and we look at the trends that we've seen, now all of this, a lot of the data that I'm showing now is coming from our Farmland owner and tenure survey that comes out every 5 years. This was the 2022 survey that just came out earlier this year. So looking at Iowa farmland, and in this slide, you're seeing several different years. You're seeing back to 1982 on this survey and how farmland is owned in the state of Iowa. Now, if you're looking at 2023, majority of farmland right now, 29% is owned by joint tenancy. Sole ownership and trust come in second, and then you can also own it by LLC, corporations, estates, partnerships, and also government or institution ground in the state of Iowa. And you can see how those numbers have changed over time. For example, trusts back in 1982, only about 1% of the ground in Iowa was held in a trust, compared to today in 2022, you've got 23% of farmland in Iowa is held in a trust as that type of ownership. Joint tenancy, tenants in common, those are in red, signifying that those have trended down as we look at long-term of the survey. LLCs is also one that is fairly new type of ownership. And you can see that LLCs is now at 9%, but that's one that's also in a highlighted green, signifying that it has increased over time as we've done the survey. So you can look at the fact that in 1982, 41% of Iowa farmland was held as a sole ownership, is how land was held at that point in time. And now that one has decreased down to 23% in 2022. If we take that 2022 number of how land is titled or owned and break it out by different areas of the state. So we've looked at the state. Now let's break it out by the different regions of the state. So the state is over on the far right side of this chart, and we can look at different areas of the state, maybe look at your area of the state, and see how land is held in ownership. So if I'm looking at, I live over on the eastern side of the state and cover the eastern, southeast side of the state. I sit there and go, okay, I look down the east central part of the state. Sole ownership, 22% of the ground is held as sole ownership, 23% in a joint tenancy, tenants in common at 11%. Partnerships and estates, those came in at 0. I would say that it's not actually 0. It's probably just a really low significant number. Not actually 0. I'm not going to call it 0. That's probably just less than 1%. We've got trusts come in at 26% of the farm ground in east central Iowa being held in a trust. Corporations at 6%, LLCs 11%, which is then 11% of the land for the state of Iowa. Okay, so looking at different numbers, you can sit there and go across. Let's look across like the sole ownership number, right? If you look across that number there, You sit there and go, well, West Central Iowa, you're more likely to have sole ownership of farmland in West Central Iowa and the northeast side of Iowa for ground that's held in sole ownership. Like joint tenancy, you look across and go, well, joint tenancy, I'm going to find it more common maybe in southwest Iowa and northeast Iowa, not as common in West Central Iowa, right? Going down to, let's look at trusts. Trust, look across the trust line and go, well, northeast Iowa, not as many acres of farmland held in a trust in northeast Iowa, but more so in the southwest portion of the state. So if I'm down in southwest Iowa, more likely to find ground that is held in a trust. Corporations, that number kind of doesn't, northwest Iowa, 8%, 2% in south central, 12% southeast Iowa. LLCs, like I say, that's kind of a new one. Central Iowa, only 2% of farm ground in an LLC. So land ownership, how it's held as ownership in different areas of the state. So this is always a fun title slide to look at when we think about 84% of Iowa farmland is owned debt-free, right? No debt against it. And this is looking from 1982 to 2022. And debt-free ground back in 1982 constituted about 62% of the acres in Iowa, compared to today when we're looking at 84% of the acres in Iowa have no debt against it. Under contract, back in 1982, we had a lot more ground and a lot more acres that was under some type of contract, under a contract. We have under contract and mortgage when it has debt against it. So under contract was more common back in 1982. And that one has significantly decreased. We're down to 2%, 2022. Ground that has a mortgage debt against it. 1982, we were at 20%. Today, we're sitting at 14%. So the under contract category has decreased as that free of debt has increased. So we've got a lot more ground that is debt-free in the state. Mortgaged, yeah, it's significantly less, and under contract is very significantly reduced when we look at the last 40 years. So again, looking at free of debt, and someone might sit there and go, well, who's free of debt on their farm ground? I've got two separate charts on this one as we think about the age of the owner and are they free of debt under a contract, or if they've got a mortgage against the farmland that they own. And then how long has that farmland been owned by the same owner? And you can see there that more than 50% of Iowa farmland has been owned by the same owner for more than 20 years. So on the free of debt side, let's start there first. When we look at this chart, you can sit there and go, if I'm over 80 years old, I'm not going to be under contract. This doesn't have 0% under contract. 95% of the ground that the over 80 category owns is free of debt. And only 5% of the ground that somebody owns that's over 80 has a mortgage against it. Contrasting to the individuals that are under the age of 35. If I'm under 35, 62% of that farm ground, if I own farm ground and I'm under the age of 35, 62% of that farm ground has a mortgage against it. 21% of that farm ground are under some type of contract, and only 17% is free of debt. Okay. So now if we go over and say, well, how long has a person owned that ground? You know, we've got numbers in here for the last 10 years. So 5 years and 10 years back to 2012, current day of 2022. So I've got, if I've owned the ground more than 50 years and current day today, that's 10% of the farmland in the state of Iowa. So you've got individuals that have owned ground for a longer period of time. As we look at the data and the trend, and individuals that are then living a long time, they're 80 years old and older and over, and they're free of debt on that ground. So if I'm less than 10 years, owned it for less than 10 years, that constitutes about 22% of the farm ground in the state of Iowa, or 22% of the farmland acres in Iowa. And you can sit there and go through those numbers. Okay, Less than 10 years, 10 to 20 years, that's 44% of the farmland, right? Less than owning it less than 20 years. And then greater than 20 years, that's greater than that 50% of farmland in the state of Iowa. So as we look at who the owners are and some of those demographics, then let's move into trends in land leasing. Looking at farm ground in the state of Iowa and the leasing portion of it, we've got 58% of the acres in Iowa that are under some type of lease agreement. 42% of the land in Iowa is owner-controlled. So let's go down through that owner-controlled portion and break out of it. So 32% owner-operated. Owners out there, they're farming it. 3% of the acres in Iowa are custom farmed, meaning the owner owns it. They hire someone to come in, do the spraying, do the combining, do the planting. They're having it custom farmed. 8% of the acres in Iowa are under some type of government program or other uses, right? One of the larger ones being that CRP program. Leased acres. So 58% of the acres in Iowa on our current survey is being leased out. Contrasting 5 years ago, that's a change from 53% to 58%. So breaking that one out a little bit more, we've got cash rent fixed or a flex lease type agreement, crop share agreement, or some type of other lease agreement, right? So 42% under a fixed cash rent, 9% under a flex lease agreement, 7% of acres are under a crop share agreement, and then that other type of lease agreement, less than 1%, right? So we're seeing, and comparing it from 2017 to 2022, we're seeing an increase in the number of acres that are under a fixed cash rent agreement. The flex lease agreement has held steady at 9% of acres, and crop share continues to decline from 9% of acres being leased out to 7% of acres being under a crop share agreement. Some of the things that contribute to the leasing as we think about leasing and who owns it and where are they living? Are they an Iowa resident full-time, part-time? They don't live in Iowa at all. Do they farm? Do they not farm? Who are these individuals as we sit there and think about what is the person and what is the typical demographic of the individual that is leasing out farm ground? So and also breaking it down to cash rent versus crop share, looking at the survey. So 70% of all leased acres. So now, no, this is just my leased acres, right? So 58% of leased acres, 70% of the landowners of the leased land, the owner lives in Iowa full-time, right? 7%, they live in Iowa part-time, so they're probably here during the summer and leave during the wintertime and the cooler times of the year. And then 23% of the acres are owned by individuals that are being leased out or owned by individuals that don't live in Iowa at all, right? So you can then break that back the other way and sit there and go, okay, crop share versus cash rent. If I live in Iowa full-time versus not, 71% full-time residents that are cash renting out are going to be on the cash rent side. Not living in Iowa at all, that's about 22% of those cash rent acres, and then part-time maybe 8%. Under crop share agreement, we're looking at 33% of the individuals don't live in Iowa at all versus that 63% of those acres from somebody that lives in Iowa full-time, and 4% as the part-time individuals. Down to the farming status, we look at the fact that I do have owners, and we sit there and say, well, you've got leased acres, but yet they farm full-time. And the answer is yes. You've got individuals that maybe inherited a piece of ground that was grandpa's. They're not going to sell it, or it's been in the family a long time. We hold a lot of value in that family farmland. And so you've got an individual that might be farming in the southeast corner of the state, but they inherited a piece of ground in the north central part of the state. They're not going to sell it. They're going to lease out those acres. So individuals that are farming full-time, but maybe leasing out some acres that they own county over, or whatever reason that they're renting out farm ground, that constitutes 8% of the farm ground that is being leased. Farming part-time, maybe I own a larger acreage or pieces of ground that I'm not able to farm all of it, and I farm part-time as well as off-farm employment as well. That constitutes 13% of the leased acres, but a majority of the acres that are in a lease agreement, that constitutes individuals that's 79% of do not farm, right? Then you can break it down into that cash rent and crop share, and you can look at those numbers and look down and say, yeah, 79% under cash rent that are being cash rented, they don't farm. Crop share, 77% of those acres are from individuals that don't farm, but then also might live in Iowa full-time or not. So then length of land by ownership and leasing relationships. So that we talked about how long has a person owned a piece of ground. In this slide, we're talking about how long has the same person or family been renting from the same individual, or been renting that length of that piece of ground. Well, how long has that leasing relationship been in place? So this kind of helps me sit there and go, well, we kind of look at all leased land over on the far right side, right? 1 year. We figure about 3% of acres roll over about every year. And this is the survey that kind of shows that data and shows that, yeah, about 3% of crop rented acres turns over every year. Every 2 to 5 years, you're going to add in another 25%. So within 5 years, we figure about 28% of acres are going to change hands by who the tenant is on that piece of ground. And you can look down and go, okay, I've had a relationship for 6 to 10 years. That constitutes about 26% of the leased acres in Iowa, 24% of acres. I've had someone with a leasing relationship that's 11 to 20 years. Greater than 20 years constitutes for 22% of the leased acres in Iowa. And it's not uncommon for me to run into an individual that has leased to the same farm family, not only for 20 years, but for multiple generations. We've got an individual that has leased to the same farm family. This individual's in her 90s. She's been leasing it to the same family for the last 40 years since she inherited the farm ground. Her father leased it to the same farm family before that. So not only is she on, and now her daughters are renting to the same farm family. So there are 3 generations of owners that have leased to the same farm family. And that farm family has also gone through 3 generations in that same time period as well. So it's not uncommon for me to find individuals that have had that leasing relationship that has been very long-term, greater than that 20 years. On average, it's about 13.6 years. So if you're looking at crop share versus cash rent, crop share, maybe at 6 to 10 years is that highest number as you look down through crop share. Cash rent, it's going to be that 2 to 5 to 11 to 20, but maybe 17% of those are still greater than 20 years, having that same relationship. So we'll get into some more demographics of our landowners now and move away from leasing a little bit, because we want to talk about a little bit more about and painting this picture of, we've got this picture of Iowa. We grow a lot of corn and beans. We've got 58% of the farmland that is leased out or under some type of lease agreement. You've got how long we've owned it, how long we've been renting the same ground from the same family. Well, let's talk a little bit more about who that individual is, right? So as we think about the age of farmland owners, and we've kind of already alluded to this a little bit, but let's get more down into the data. Let's go from 1982. We've got the data from 82 all the way up to current 2022. And I'm going to start at the very bottom there and say, okay, in those that were greater than the age of 74, and we've broken them out and say early stage of life, mid stage, and late stage of life. So greater than 74 in 1982, that percent of farm ground owned by individuals over the age of 74 was 12% of the farmland in Iowa. Contrast to 2022, where we've got 37% of the acres are currently owned by somebody that's over the age of 74. And actually, when you look at greater than the age of 65, that's 66% of the acres in Iowa are owned by somebody over the age of 65 and over. Age less than 25, or let's say 20, up to age 34 and under. In 1982, that was about 11% of the farm ground in Iowa. And today, we're looking at 2% of the farmland that's owned by somebody under the age of 35. And then mid-stage as well, as you're looking at that. If I add in that 55 and older, all of a sudden I'm at 86% of the farmland in Iowa is owned by somebody 55 and older. We look at owners and we look at percent of acres because you have to delineate between the two. So I've got in this chart, I've got my acres, percent of acres owned by somebody in each age category, and what percent of owners in the state of Iowa are in each age category. So this kind of helps you say, well, maybe if I'm an older individual, I own more acres, even though I'm not as many of the owners. And so that's where this number is different from percent of owners versus the percent of acres. I think of a 25-year-old, 30-year-old, they're probably not going to own 500 to 1,000 acres, whereas maybe somebody that is over the age of 75, as they've invested in farmland throughout their life, has more acres than an individual that's only 25 to 30. So you can look down the difference between the percent of acres owned from somebody in that age group versus the percent of owners in the different age groups. Okay. So then also looking at that full-time resident in Iowa, part-time resident, or not a resident of Iowa at all, looking at the percent of acres versus the percent of owners, right? 80% of my owners in Iowa are full-time, farmland owners are full-time residents of Iowa, whereas they constitute maybe 75% of the acres. The not a resident is constituting 20% of the acres in Iowa, but only 14% of the owners, right? And we have seen a significant jump in the non-residents being a part-time owner and not resident, going from 20% in 2017 to 25% in 2022. We've got our age in there. Well, let's break it down a little bit further by gender on this one. I've got my 1982 data to 2022. And as you look across from 1982 to 2022, there's not much of a change from male to female demographic of owner. You look at 1982, I had 53% of the farmland owned by a male and 47% owned by a female. Changing it out to 2022 today, you've got 54% of the farmland is owned by a male and 46% owned by a female. So that number hasn't really changed in the last 40 years, right? But let's get down to the age, and we're not breaking this age one out by year. We're just going to look at the current year of 2022, age group. And this is the data that also supports the fact that, yes, wives are going to outlive their husbands, females are out going to live males. And as you look at that greater than 80 demographic, then you've got 13% of the farmland is owned by somebody that's a female over the age of 80 versus that individual that is male over the age of 80 owning 8% of the farmland is owned by a male that's over the age of 80. That greatest percentage-wise is the 65 to 80-year-olds, male to female, 24%, 21%, and 21% of the farm ground owned by a male that's between the age of 35 and 64, whereas that 35 to 64 female group only owns about 11% of the farmland in the state of Iowa. So that's hopefully helped paint a picture of who owns farmland in Iowa. What is the demographic? Are they male? Are they female? Are their age? Are they living in Iowa? Do they live somewhere else? Are they leasing the ground out? Are they in a cash rent situation? Are they in a crop share situation? Okay, now let's move and shift gears onto this conservation side and the practices and conservation programs. In the survey we asked questions about it, and we'll get into that here in just a second. So conservation practice adoption, we asked the questions in 2017, so 5 years ago, and in 2022, on the survey. So that's actually 6 years ago, and here this last year. So asking what percent of owners and acres are in no-till, cover crops, buffer strips. We get into the saturated buffers, a bioreactor, nutrient removal, wetlands, reduced tillage, and grassed waterways. We asked these questions and said, okay, what conservation practices have we adopted and are we doing on our farm ground? So looking at 2022, we're starting out here with 30% of acres on the survey show that are in a no-till situation, our conservation practice on their farm, which constitutes 29% of owners. Looking back to 5 years ago, that shows that, yeah, that number is still increasing, because 5 years ago on the survey, at 2017, we had 27% of the acres in a no-till conservation practice, which constituted 21% of the owners. So we're seeing an increase in no-till adoption. We're seeing an increase in the cover crops as we went from 4% of the acres to 7% of the acres in Iowa under a cover crop. Buffer strips, I would say that 3 to 3 and 3 to 2, I would say buffer strips is probably about the same, or maybe they've switched buffer strips out into a saturated buffer. We didn't ask the questions of saturated buffer, bioreactor, reduced tillage, or grass waterways on the last survey, so not applicable, but maybe some of those acres from buffer strips went over into those other conservation practices. So we're starting to see some of these conservation practices throughout the state on some of the acres. When we ask the question on reduced tillage, we're sitting there going, yeah, 40% of acres is under some type of reduced tillage, which constitutes for about 36% of our owners in the state of Iowa. Grassed waterways, 62% of owners were like, yeah, we've got grassed waterways. Number of acres, we're not going to say how many acres are under a grassed waterway. That just kind of doesn't make sense, but more so on the adoption rate of how many owners are doing grassed waterways in the state of Iowa. Breaking those conservation practices out by district for the 2022 survey. So we've got the state number over on the far right, and I'm looking at no-till across the top, right? So where am I more likely to see no-till in the state of Iowa? And looking across the top, you're sitting there, well, Southwest Iowa. If I go to Southwest Iowa, I'm more likely to see no-till conservation practices being done than I would in North Central Iowa, where only 18% of farm ground is in a no-till conservation practice. Cover crops, the lowest number, if you go across, if I'm going to go somewhere and not see a lot of cover crops, that's West Central Iowa, as opposed to Northwest Iowa and Southeast Iowa, and even Northeast, Southeast Iowa, and Northwest Iowa are my areas where I have seen more of the greater adoption of acres into cover crops. Buffer strips, Northeast Iowa kind of leads the way in amount of buffer strips or adoption in that area of the state. Central Iowa, East Central Iowa, yeah, we're getting there in the 2% for some of the other areas. Saturated buffers, if I'm in Central Iowa or Southwest Iowa, that's where I might see more of my saturated buffer. The nutrient removal wetlands, so this one's a new one, but I might see more in Northeast, West Central Iowa, areas of that area. Reduced tillage, areas with reduced tillage that are the greatest, I'm going to see that more in East Central Iowa and Northwest Iowa than in other areas of the state. And my grassed waterways, you can see that where I might not see grassed waterways the most, more your flat area, North Central Iowa, versus that East Central Iowa at 85%. So you can kind of look through and go, where do these different conservation practices that we see and we're adopting in areas of the state, where might it make sense for different areas versus others? And that's kind of what we see, especially when we think about grassed waterways or buffer strips, saturated buffers. Where are they working and where can they work in different areas of the state? So we asked the question, who makes the decision to make a new change in the conservation practices of the farm, right? And especially when we think about the leased acres, that 58% of leased acres, is it a single season practice or is it a permanent practice that we're going to put into place? Are there government programs that I'm going into? Who makes the decision? Is it the owner? Is it the tenant? Is it both? And when we look at a tenant owner relationship, more than likely, if it's a single season practice, the tenant's going to make that decision. You can see that 44% of the time on a single season practice, such as I'm going to do a cover crop for 1 year, I'm going to do a no-till or reduced tillage. That's probably more of that tenant decision. The owner decision, more than likely, it's going to be that permanent practice as opposed to that single season decision. And, who's going to make that decision on maybe going into a government program? More than likely going to be the owner versus the tenant. But when we look down, and this is what really helps me sit there and go, yeah, we've got individuals that are out there doing a great job and having a great owner-tenant relationship. Because when we look at the both owner and tenant, making that single season decision, making the permanent practice decisions together, and deciding, do we need to go into some type of government program? That's both an owner and a tenant. So looking down, both the owner and the tenant is actually higher on single season practice, permanent practices, and government programs. There's a lot of different programs that are out there when we think about conservation. One of those is the carbon credits program. And so we asked the question, how familiar are you with the carbon credit program, right? With carbon credits and different programs that are out there, right? So we asked the owners, are you familiar with it? And you can go down and look, and it's like, well, 30% of owners never heard of carbon credit programs. 46%, yeah, we've heard of them, not interested. So all of a sudden you've got 76% saying, we've heard of it, not interested of it, or haven't heard of carbon credits at all. And you can look and say, well, how many acres does that constitute for? So if you heard of it and are interested, that's 19%. Are you considering participating? 3%. And about 2% say, yeah, we've already signed up and are participating in programs. So this is I've got a few more tables here. We've got percentage of Iowa landowners with land that is leased out that requires a conservation practice, that they've actually written it into their lease agreement, right? And these numbers are fairly low. A lot of times I don't see these written into lease agreements. But for example, I've got 58% of the farmland. How much of that has a no-till clause in the lease agreement saying you will do no-till? Well, that's about 3%. Or cover crops, that's 1%. Doing reduced tillage, 3%. A nutrient management. Now, we might have nutrient management plans, but having the owner leasing it out and having it in the contract, that's only about 7%. And then some other type of conservation practice in the lease agreement constitutes about 5%. So, and this is not for all Iowa farmland owners. This is just for that 58% of farmland that is in a lease type of agreement. So we asked owners if they would be willing to encourage their tenants. So this is back to that leasing question and conservation. If the owner was willing to encourage their tenant to adopt cover crops by maybe paying for part of the planting cost. Right? And we've got 2017 numbers and as well as 2022 numbers. And you can see where back in 2017, we had a higher percentage say, yeah, I'd be willing, as opposed to 2022 saying, no, I'd probably not. And the maybes probably stayed about the same. So thinking about who the owner is, tenant relationships with owners, demographics, are you willing to pay a little bit for no-till? So this is landowners' effectiveness of no-till and cover crops and reducing nitrogen and phosphorus. So how do you think it's going? Does it work? Is it effective? Is it somewhat effective? And we asked landowners, this is beyond the renting agreement. This is all landowners. And it's like we had a lot of individuals that just didn't know or didn't answer. But 36% of respondents said, yeah, no-till is making a difference. Cover crops, 36%. Yes, it's making a difference in reducing nitrogen and phosphorus runoff in the Iowa waterways. So this is the perception of landowners and their perceived effectiveness of reducing these nitrogen and phosphorus in our waterways. No-till, or getting down to the not effective, we're sitting there going, yeah, a little to not effective is that 1 to 5% and 1 to 8%. So landowners' willingness to adopt conservation practices, if there was a cost share payment from a government program out in place, 2% didn't answer. But yeah, 19% of landowners said, yeah, if there was a cost share payment, sure, yeah, I'd do this. What would be your willingness to adopt? Well, some willingness. The not at all was the highest one, saying 37%. Even if there was a government payment out there, I'm not going to worry about my willingness to adopt. Does that change my willingness to adopt a different conservation practice based on cost share? 37% said, yeah, doesn't affect it at all in their decision-making process. So we've painted a picture of Iowa farmland owners and acres across the state. We've talked about conservation. I've got just a few slides here talking about communication. So this is just the map. This is back in 2017, looking at, this is the USDA study, Census of Ag in 2017. We put this out in May of 19. So they're going, okay, percent of rented farmland based on different counties in the state. Fun map to just kind of go, changes from Davis County at 23% of the farmland being rented out versus Hancock County at 62%. Okay, so we've got rented acres out there, right? I've got communication. Biggest thing to do with communication is simply having a written lease agreement. So I've got a lot of different files on Ag Decision Maker. This is C2-16. You can go on Ag Decision Maker, on the Ag Decision Maker website. Having a written lease agreement goes a long way in communication, but I want to do more than just having a written lease agreement in place. If I'm going to do some conservation or supplement, doing some investment on improvements on a piece of rented ground, I've got a lease supplement, not just have a lease agreement, but have a lease supplement for investing in improvements such as repairs and rates of depreciation and spreading lime. I've got this lease supplement. I've got another one for obtaining conservation practices to controlling soil and nutrient losses, file C2-08. I've also got one for if I'm going to look at doing some drainage and tile improvements. This is also a supplement that I can have with my lease agreement between my landowner and tenant, C2-29. All of those things hopefully can help me with my communication, because a lot of the phone calls that I get as a farm management field specialist deal with the breakdown of communication between a landowner and tenant, right? We've seen landowners that send a monthly email, phone calls. The 96-year-old, she likes a phone call. She calls 3 or 4 times a year, right? Some people have a Facebook or Twitter or blog or stopping for a cup of coffee. I would say anything that you can do to increase communication, whether you're a landowner or you're a tenant, with that relationship that you have, is going to go a long way, especially when we think about adopting conservation practices and having those lease agreements in place. I've got this one that it's an annual report. Every year, tenant fills out this annual report. This is what happened. This is when we planted. It's great for their own records as well to pass on to the landowner to say, this is what we've done. And it opens up that conversation from each other. So file C2-06. So a lot of different resources that are out there to help individuals as they think about who owns farm ground, especially when we think about ground that is being leased, who my tenant is, who my landowner is, and opening up this conversation of what conservation practices am I doing? Where can I go with that? And what can I do to make sure that either entity is protected as we move forward? There will be conflicts, right? We've got family and business conflicts. A lot of times the worst ones are when it's family. So I've got C4-74. So managing that conflicts, initiating the dialogue, involving all the parties, building that trust, and negotiating disagreements and solidifying agreements. As you think about managing those conflicts, it's better up front, and communication goes a long way. Having things written down also helps manage conflicts as I sit there and visit with people throughout the state. Hopefully you found this enjoyable and found some useful information. as we've talked about the farmland in Iowa, and as we look at farmland not only in Iowa, but globally and nationally, but specifically to Iowa, how the ownership has changed over time, how the demographics has changed over time, and as we look forward to the future and opening up and thinking about what conservation practices I've got, hopefully this helps you as you think about who your tenant is, who your landlord is, who the individuals are that you're working with as we work towards opening up that conservation, what conservation practices are there, and opening up that conservation practice or that dialogue to maybe doing more, or what things we need to do on a piece of ground that you're involved in and who you work with. So thank you for your time. This has been Ryan Droletti with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach.